Welcome to all, and thank you for giving up your time to come and join us for the launch of Mukund's debut book. I think I didn't realize the copies were there, but I'm very proud to have one here. Thank you, Mukund, for giving the great flap of 1942. I've just about finished reading the book. I must say it's a compelling illustration of events that took place in a very, he focuses in a very narrow period between December 1941 and mid 1942. Interesting period because there was a frightful panic in India that there was an impending invasion of the Japanese, and how the people from the coastal regions were all, there's an exodus of movement from the coastal regions to the central, safer regions of India. And of course, this is all set in a larger political context. Mukund examines ways in which this whole period changed the face of nationalist politics and British attitudes to India's independence. I must say the style, if I have to describe it, is racy, it's vivid, it's poignant, it's heart-wrenching at times, but also very witty in terms of how he presents it, and so beautifully captured, and says everything that the reviewers actually have said about the book. Quite stunning reviews of the book, and I want to just cite William Dalrymple's comments on Mukund as the most admired journalist and editor India has ever had. And the book, absolutely, and his work as superbly researched, tightly constructed, and pinned to the page in stylish, witty, and evocative prose. Mukund, you couldn't get a better review than that from William Dalrymple. Beautiful. And I must say, it's a must read, everybody should read. And most importantly, Mukund dedicates quite naturally, I would say, to his mother. And the reason for that is the stories he heard from his mother as a child. And you can imagine when you're reading the book, you can imagine Mukund, a little boy, listening intently to his mother, listening to these stories. The trigger for the idea of this book came from those stories. Because his mother and family fled the city of Madras during that period. And it's very vividly portrayed. And because this is also the time when it was so close to an imminent invasion that there were air raid programs launched, the slit trenches, even in West Bengal. I mean, I didn't realize this, but 142 miles of slit trenches going up to Asansol, Chittagong, Mahmood Singh, and it was all so real. But actually, this whole panic, the impending attack, never really happened, as we know. But the chapters that portray or explore the details of the historical, gives a very good historical account of Japanese entry into Singapore, Malay, Burma, and other Southeast Asians. It's a very good blend of rich history there, beautifully captured, beautifully written. And I can go on and on about it because it was so gripping. In one sitting, I finished the book. It's really good. And of course, in this interactive session, we're going to have, I think it's Ashik who's going to have a conversation with Mukund, and Mukund will tell us more about the book. And we'll have a Q&A after Prithvi concludes with some remarks at the end. You all may have already heard, but if you haven't, I do want to tell you that Mukund has been conferred the title of Distinguished Professor of Philosophy. So Mukund, congratulations on a very well-deserved recognition and for this fantastic achievement.
Mukund, let me begin with a sort of a shadow of a memory, right? So I was reading the history of the school I'm from, the Laidlaw Memorial School in the Nilgiris. It's in KT, a little ways away from Ooty. And I was reading about the Second World War in the school. It's just a line or two. And what they talk about is endless drills for air raids, right? There is a garden located in the school now where pine trees grow. But that space actually was the space that had first been cleared of bushes to dig trenches, right? Now I always wondered what were they worried about? Did they think the Germans are going to come all the way from Germany or North Africa to bomb an insignificant school in the Nilgiris? But that's precisely sort of covers the kind of attitude that had struck much of South India at that point in time. What might people in South India have feared in 1942 about about bombing, about the possibility of being bombed, about the things associated with the war?
I mean, what we know now, South India is a large place, but if we talk about the Madras presidency particularly, uh, one of the things that led to the panic is that Madras somehow was always, the fate of Madras was always twinned to Singapore. And there's very interesting discussions in the corporation proceedings of Madras uh, on the importance of seeing that Singapore is secure and is safe. And the Madras Corporation at one point actually donates a sum of 10,000 rupees to Singapore. I mean, it's a flea bite, but still it's reflective of how important Singapore. Madras felt Singapore was important for its security, and so when Singapore fell, I think the presidency went into a panic. That was one reason. The second reason why it went into panic was because Governor Hope, who was headed the Madras presidency, actually got false military intelligence late in April that a huge Japanese fleet was headed towards its shores to land somewhere south of Madras. And so then scattered his entire government. So the sort of broad answer is that different places, the triggers were different in different places. And April 1942 is, we're talking about towards the end of the Great Flap. But the panic happened much earlier. The panic set in as soon as Japan invaded Malaya. And, the first wave actually happened out of Calcutta, which, about a week after December 7th, which is when, synchronously with Pearl Harbor, they attacked Malaya. Calcutta begins to get into a flap, and 17% of Calcutta evacuates in 17 days. So one of the things I'm trying to say in this book is there is this exodus that has happened. It is possible that very conservatively 75% of Madras fled. It's possible that almost 90% did. I believe the number is almost 90%. Vishakhapatnam emptied out. Kakinada you had what the British described as an exodus even from places like Delhi and Ahmedabad. People fled Jamshedpur. You talk of Ooty, and Governor Hope sort of is distraught that the white population in Ooty is in a panic, and he says, I expect better of Europeans than this. Kodaikanal, the missionaries there was a big flap in Kodaikanal, and the missionaries fled. So this is the extent of the panic, I argue in the book, has been largely ignored or forgotten. So I asked this question, and I've asked this question of Orias, for instance, and Vishnu, quite honestly, has answered whether people know that the capital of Cuttack moved to Sambalpur. And I haven't met an Oriya who hasn't, and Vishnu, as knowledgeable as he is, admits that he has forgotten it. I've asked the same question I was at the festivals of Calicut in Kerala. How many people know that the secretariat in Cochin was moved to Trishur? Nobody knew. So to me, this was, one aspect of the book. One part of it was to actually map the extent of this flap or the panic, which, as I argue, got lost.
Right. So at the beginning of the book, you say that this is not a story with a climax, right? This is a story that's sort of open-ended. Why did you sort of choose to say that, and what might this tell us about the wider history of the time?
Well, I think there were two things that were happening then. I mean, you had the nationalist historians. If they look at 42, what are they looking at? Essentially, they're looking at Cripps, and the failure of the Cripps mission. And they're also looking at Gandhi's, radicalization in the middle of 42, and then the eventual call to quit India. So there is a focus on the politics of the time, essentially. the British again were interested in the war as it was playing out in Europe. So somehow this story has got squeezed between two historical stools. I mean, it doesn't fit into, the either grand narrative of decolonization or of the freedom, from either side, or the struggle for freedom. So I think this is why the story has got lost. And then finally, this was a non-event. The invasion never happened. I mean, they did bomb a lot of places, but the invasion did never happen. So I think that was another reason for this neglect. And let me, I mean, I'm going beyond your question here, but if you'll allow me, I think there's a third reason for it. And as a journalist, I was sort of deeply disappointed when I encountered this because I poured through papers. I mean, it's the Hindu, the Statesman, particularly these two newspapers, but also the Mail in Madras, which, and some others, the Indian Express as well. Went through it fairly systematically and with some pain because, flipping through pages, going through. And you would imagine that if there was such a frightful panic, it would be on your front pages. Mm-hmm. You would imagine that if Madras evacuated, you'd have photographs of empty streets. You'd have, feature writing about people leaving. There's none of that. Mm-hmm. There is the odd editorial. There's the odd call that people shouldn't panic. I mean, there is that kind of comment. But I think it's reflective of the fact that at that time, these human interest stories of displacement, of loss, and then I compare it to what the media did when, the COVID exodus happened, and there was so much of coverage. There's nothing. There is just small single columns here and there of what was happening. And maybe there's not much talk of this even from our nationalist leaders. I mean, there are references in, that Gandhi makes. He believes that people, for instance, should leave. Mm-hmm. That we're not, others argue that, it's fine if people leave because they're not armed. They can't resist the Japanese, so why can't they leave? But there is no focus on the loss of livelihood, the disruption in people's lives, none of that. That hasn't been captured at all in I haven't seen that kind of story written up anywhere.
Certainly.
So that was disappointing.
Interesting. So how have you organized the book? What is the organization of the book in terms of chapters and things like that? How would you explain it to an audience that perhaps hasn't read it yet?
Well, the organization of the book, someone has reminded me, it's not linear.
Right.
So it's, people have asked me, why didn't I just relate it in a chronological fashion? I didn't want to do that. So I think they're basically three sections. So there's one section in which I map what Japan does in Malaya, Singapore, and Burma, and then sort of relate it to what's happening at home. So that's one section. And then of course there are sections on the panic, the rumor, and all of that. And then there's another section on how what is happening actually impacts the nationalist movement and also the British attitudes to war. And I argue that the entry of Japan actually divides the Congress, unlike some who've claimed that the war brought people together, some historians. And the third section actually maps the Exodus, attempts to map the Exodus, which argues not only in Madras, which is a little known about, but was pretty much pan-Indian.
So let's begin with the first section,
Okay.
Where you talk about Malaya and what happened in Singapore and so on. So what was the prevailing attitude to the possibility of war with Japan? What were Japanese views on war with India? And what was the sort of general understanding of people on the ground in South Asia and Southeast Asia about what was going to happen before December 1941? So
the general understanding was if there was a threat to India during World War II, it would either come from the Northeast or it might come, from the, not West, or from the Northeast via the Chinese side. Nobody anticipated it would come from Southeast Asia. Because Singapore, as Chris Bailey famously writes, every schoolboy knew it was Britain's impregnable bastion. It couldn't fall. And I think the Indians were sort of schooled on that as well. So nobody expected the Japanese to rip through Southeast Asia as they did. And so the threat emerged from a completely unexpected quarter, even though there were fears about Singapore much earlier. The military thought it would come from a completely
different direction.
Different direction.
I mean, for me, as I've said, what really fascinates me about the book is what you've stated were Japanese strategies with regard to Greater South Asia, right? Like so far, in general, historians have tended to say that the Japanese didn't really think very much about India. India emerges kind of as an afterthought. Once they've taken Burma and they begin to kind of look across the rainforest. But you've made certain revisions to that. You've pointed out the extent to which India sort of figures in Japanese thinking, if not necessarily in Japanese planning. How does that?
I
can
think
you tell us?
ever since they signed the tripartite pact, I think Japan signaled that there was a part of the world that it was its. There's a Japanese term for it. I forget. It's living space in a way, and the Greater Asia.
Saikuken, I think.
Saikuken, yeah. the Greater East Asia Prosperity Sphere initially didn't include India, but it was only later that they thought, there's some references. It's not very clear what exactly it included and what it didn't include, but there were references to India made a little later. So there was essentially, it's quite clear that they wanted to rid Asia of the British influence of the British and the Dutch and so on. And they managed to do it for a while, I think, at least for a short while. But the point I'm making in the book is that they had no plans at that particular time to invade India. There was no plan at all. All they wanted to do was to create disruption, undermine confidence in the Raj, which they did, I think, very, very
spectacularly.
Yeah, and because, as Gandhi himself says, that there is a sizable number of people who think, the entry of Japan will actually help in ridding us of the British, and so there was something like an undercurrent of sympathy for Japan. There's one place where there's an official who actually says that the number of Japanese primers have actually, the demand for that has increased quite a bit. So there was an undercurrent of sympathy, and that undercurrent, I think, was held together also by the fact that Japan there wasn't a battle they lost, right? There was nothing they lost till about mid-42, when the Americans came in and engaged them in naval battles.
Right. But it wasn't just with bombs that the Japanese were attacking India. You also talk about how they used radios as a means of promoting propaganda and panic in India. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean that happened from Germany as well. Bose was in Berlin using what he called what was it, free Azad in the radio to make his broadcasts, and the Japanese were doing this as well. I mean, they had the Japanese had once they took Singapore and so on, they had stations that were beaming propaganda into India, but essentially saying, rid yourself of the yoke. You're like us. You're Asian. So essentially that kind of propaganda, and that propaganda got the British very, very rattled. And the BBC was then commanded to counter this. And as I mentioned, one of the superstars in the BBC was actually George Orwell, a great supporter of Indian self-rule, but actually then joins the BBC to do his little bit of propaganda on the British side.
Absolutely. Yeah. You mentioned Subhash Chandra Bose, and you've spoken about him quite extensively through the book Bose and the INA and so on. Where do you stand on the wider debate about the role of the INA in the sort of national struggle? Were they, one extreme is that they were basically collaborators with fascism. The other extreme is that they were sort of freedom fighters fighting for sort of Indian nationalism. Where do you land on that spectrum, or do you see it?
I would
see
land
that
on both.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, certainly they collaborated with the Japanese. There's no doubt about that. And it was a creation of the Japanese, And Bose comes in much later. I mean, it's, Pritam Singh and Mohan Singh who actually set up the INA, and then Bose takes it over when it's already created in there. Um, so, yes, I mean, there were collaborators in this, but they were also driven by a fair sense of nationalism. I don't see any problem in upholding both positions. And people have done that kind of thing before. I mean, people who,
What was the overall sort of Congress response to to the possibility of the INA making inroads in India and things like that?
the Congress response.
The Congress response or response from various sectors of the party.
Well, I mean, by the time the INA does get in, by the time 44 happens, Subhash Chandra Bose does make a little foray in the northeast of India, the Japanese naval fleet is just completely vanquished, and I don't mention it in the book, but the probable reason why the Japanese do attack in 44 is for strategic reasons, to cut out roads and so on, and to forestall a British offensive that is very much in the making, because Slim is already prepared to go into Burma. He knows that he can go through Burma. So I wouldn't make much of what happened in 1944. I mean, they fought. I mean, Kohima was a fierce battle, no doubt. But by 44, the Japanese were not the Japanese of 42. They had lost. They'd fought the Battle of Coral Sea, where where the losses were more or less equal with the Japanese, and then their navy was virtually destroyed in the Battle of Midway.
Absolutely.
So,
can you tell us a little bit about the bombings that did take place before the Battle of Coral Sea in India, and what kinds of responses they elicited across the country in terms of Madras, Vizag, Colombo, Chittagong?
well, Madras, as it turned out, just has one.
Yeah.
And it didn't happen in 42. It happened in October 43, when a lone Japanese reconnaissance plane drops a few bombs in the harbor. And that hardly creates a flutter. If you look at the newspapers of that day, there's small single columns that say, Madras harbor attacked, and I think 4 people died or something, 4 or 6. The Vizag and Kakinada attacks were not, the Kakinada again was a minor attack. Vizag was bombed, but the northeast, and I think we know that Calcutta was bombed repeatedly from late 42 onwards. But there are places in the northeast that were bombed soon after Vizag and Kakinada. And that is another sort of set of events that have seemed to have almost slipped from historical memory. They attack a tea estate, believing that it was a railway station, for instance. 43 people are killed in Dhabi tea estate. They attack Impal. So they do a fair amount of bombing in Bengal in the northeast. Calcutta, despite its strategic importance, gets bombed for the first time only in December 1942, which is very surprising, since you would imagine that was the first city gripped by panic, and that was a city that was engaged in war production, and Linlithgow is constantly worried that if there is an exodus from Calcutta, which there is, then the people engaged in making resources for the war might leave as well, and that would be a problem. So it's surprising that the Japanese look at Kakinada and Vishakhapatnam and not Calcutta.
Can you walk us through these evacuations? What did they involve in terms of both the evacuations and the exoduses, especially in places like Madras? You have a lot of interesting details of what happened, on the ground in terms of things like the courts and the prisons and so on. Can you just give us some of those details about how the exodus plays out?
So Madras is the only city where there's an official advisory saying if you are inessential or if you don't have any business here, please leave. So, that's quite a pretty clear order saying there's a threat, leave. Though they've issued advisories before saying that you could leave if you choose to. It's better to leave now than later. But after this false intelligence of a Japanese fleet comes in, there is a clear advisory saying please leave. So in Calcutta and in Bombay, the governors are contemplating issuing such advisories, but they're worried that if they issue such an advisory, then too many people who are engaged in vital services and in the war and in war production or war equipment production might leave. So there's an issue there, and they're also, they're actually contemplating this, both of them, but they don't actually go as far as issuing the orders. So essentially, two or three things. There's one pattern that holds good in the Exodus. Everywhere in the big cities, whether it's Calcutta, Bombay, or Madras, it's or mainly Calcutta and Bombay perhaps, it's the non-native businessmen that leave first. And then women and children are then, asked to leave as well, while I guess the men stay over to earn their livelihood as long as they can. So that pattern happens pretty much everywhere. It happens in Vishakhapatnam, it happens here to a certain extent. It happens very much in Calcutta, Bombay, in Delhi. So that's a pattern that takes place wherever it happens. So but the reasons for the exodus vary. In a place like Jamshedpur, for instance, which had the largest steel making plant in the British Empire, the moment they bring in aircraft guns and aircraft gunners come into the town, the people fear that something is going to happen, and they flee. In Kodaikanal, it's a wild rumor that leads the white people to sort of leave Kodaikanal. And what can be more sequestered than Kodaikanal? It's quite crazy. That.
Yeah. Look, speaking of white people, the role of racism in much of the book is quite pronounced, starting from the evacuations in Penang and going all the way down through the book. Can you tell us a little bit about how racism and racial discrimination played a role in your book in general?
Well, I think there is some evidence to support the idea that racial discrimination, particularly in Malaya, it was much greater than it was in India. I mean, could have played a role in at least encouraging the formation of the INA. Yeah, people were fed up with there were swimming pools to which Indian officers were not allowed to, whereas white officers were allowed to. An Indian officer, is not allowed to get into a certain train compartment, whereas a white subordinate is. So you had rules that like that play out, which certainly, there's army writing about this, saying this was happening and we didn't like it. But of course, Hugh Toy says that to believe that the INA was created because of racism alone is probably an exaggeration. I think he's right. But it certainly did play a role in doing that. And Penang was the most, I think, telling illustration of racism, because the white population just evacuate. Not just the population, the white soldiers as well. They just abandon Penang, and then the Japanese come in and bomb the place and create a lot of havoc. So, and then there was racial discrimination in the evacuation of people from Burma. So this racism had its echo pretty much everywhere, and in the Central Legislative Assembly, in the Council of States, there were questions raised about this.
Yeah. In addition to race, you also talk extensively about gender and how people felt threatened by not only the possibility of bombing, but also by the presence of troops in many of these sort of urban areas.
So that was quite, that was again a revelation for me, that there was so much of panic, that the arrival of white troops caused so much panic. Sorry?
Someone's on Zoom.
Outside.
Could we, have tech? Yeah, please.
Yes, so the arrival of white soldiers in the created panic. The arrival of the army, non-soldiers as well, but the arrival of white soldiers particularly created a considerable amount of panic everywhere. I mean, there's evidence to suggest that people fled when they arrived, fearing rape more than And there was lots of documented instances of army misbehavior at that time. There was also a surge in prostitution, which Yasmin Khan also
Yes.
refers to. But yeah, uh, they had more money, so they could pay more for women. And so there
The
was
Americans in particular.
the Americans in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we sort of open the floor to Q&A, I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions regarding the craft of the work you've done. So how does one go about writing a book about
Well-
event that didn't happen? How do you start and how do you then go about it?
Well, I mean, I think I'd be far better at telling you how not to write a book, because one of the big mistakes I made in the beginning was to read, uh, you know, files and books and other things, and assume it will all stay in my head, and the manuscript will flow afterwards. And then you find you forget, and you have to go back. So the one thing I've learned from this, and I certainly will, but keep in mind if I write another book, is that you need to read in a slightly more boring and painful fashion, not for enjoyment, but for the purposes of taking notes and having an idea where each bit can be slotted in. So I've certainly learned that the hard way. So, I sometimes, I'm not a very good example of how, but I know I didn't want to write a linear book.
Right.
I didn't want to write a chronological book. I thought, something that went back and forth, something that dealt with issues subject-wise, would be just more interesting as a narrative than something that was chronological.
Absolutely.
So,
And this is something we were talking about slightly earlier as well, which is that how does your background as a journalist affect your writing as opposed to perhaps being a more traditional sort of academic writer of history? How does that change the way you approach the subject?
I could have written something twice the size. I had the material, I had the notes, I had all of that. But one thing I really wanted to do was not lose reader attention. I mean, Nirmala very kindly says that she read it at one sitting, and I just wanted people to be immersed in the book. There could have been a lot more, and somebody would have said, oh, a lot more research has gone into it. I could have provided more examples, more sources. But one of my concerns was really, and I think this probably comes from being a journalist, keep the reader engaged. Because finally, I was not writing for, I was writing for a wider audience, not necessarily an academic audience.
Sure.
I was not, writing to get a tick on whatever, to advance in an academic career or whatever. So I was quite clear that what I wanted to do was grip the reader. I just hope, and I think, it's up to other readers to do it, that it also has the heft of a researched work, and that it delves into things that, in a manner, at least how it explains the impact of the war on the nationalist movement. I find those were the most difficult chapters to write, because there are changes, there are divisions. Gandhi himself, for instance, is a pretty complicated figure during that period. The positions he takes. So, I mean, these are things I wanted to bring out, but I didn't want to lose the reader while I was doing that. I hope I succeeded, at least some.
I certainly think you have. What are the sort of key takeaways, as it were, that you would sort of subscribe from the book? What are the 2 or 3 key things that really struck you while you were doing your research?
Well, I mean, one thing is that if there was such a large and unmapped exodus, I think that is something that the book points out. I think it analyzes the nationalist movement against the shadow of war. Cripps, for instance, there are reams and reams of paper expended on the Cripps mission. But a lot of it is written as if it was 2 people sitting across a negotiation table. There's an offer, there's a counter proposal, so on and so forth. And finally, the final offer is not good enough, and the entire thing fell apart because they didn't offer Indians a defense portfolio. What gets forgotten in this whole story and is that when Crips came to India, within days, the Japanese had taken the ambulance. They'd bombed Colombo, they'd bombed Trincomalee, they'd sunk the Hermes, they'd sunk another 2 destroyers. There was, Nagumo, the hero of Pearl Harbor, creating havoc in Sri Lanka. There was another Vice Admiral who was with his fleet, which also had Ozawa, had only 1 aircraft carrier, whereas Nagumo came in with 5. Just taking down merchant ships of, flying flags of different countries over 2 days. And all this stuff was happening. And I think that story is another story which I think somehow has got lost in the telling. And we I think there's a case to believe that Indians were aware, or the Indian nationalists at least were aware that the Japanese were winning. And Gandhi himself said, Nehru himself says that Gandhi thought the Japanese were winning. Now, to at least ask the question, could this have influenced his rejection of Crips? I don't think is a bizarre question to ask. Because when Crips comes to India, Gandhi refuses to see him. He says, Crips, you know my view on the war, because he's aware that anything that Crips offers is in exchange for Congress support for the war. So he tells Crips, you know my view about the war, why should I meet you? And then Crips insists. He sends Nehru and Azad. And it's only when Crips insists, he very reluctantly says, all right, I'll meet you. So I think we need to examine the events of 1942. The other thing is, Gandhi is always on the so-called right or the moderate section of the Congress, right? It's Nehru and Bose early on. They're frustrated at his alleged lack of, whatever. His radicalization pushed the British out. He's always holding them back. In 42, there's this, what Sumit Sarkar calls a sudden and remarkable transformation in Gandhi. Now, what's brought about that transformation? We know from Nehru, we think maybe he had intimations of mortality, he was getting old. That could be one part of the story. But could it be completely divorced from what was happening at the geopolitical level? I'm not quite so sure. So I think these questions are worth asking. We're never going to know the truth with any certainty, because I think that comes with history. But I think that the shadow of the war and what the impact it had on the momentous events, 2 momentous events of 1942, Crips and Gandhi's radicalization, which finally led to Quit India, I think are again questions that I ask, which I think that's another thing that I think is part of the book.
Because it quite considerably alters his views on violence, right?
Yeah, which is another thing that, I've talked to historians of that period, and that's another story that's got slipped. From 39, Gandhi's telling Lithgow, I'm not going to do anything since you're at war, and I do nothing to embarrass the British government. Okay? And then he, according to Nehru's own biographer, Gopal, he suddenly adopts what Gopal calls, I'm not calling this a pro-Japanese position. And he's accused of this because he writes a couple of essays, why I'm not pro-Japanese. He's actually forced to defend himself. So you have this shift, if that's a shift at all. And you have this draft that he puts out in 1942, which Nehru has to completely remake, saying our quarrel is not with Japan. And he says, we will, after Britain goes, we will negotiate with Japan. And Nehru is actually horrified. And he manages to pull back this draft and gets it reworded in a more sort of even-handed fashion, one that doesn't tilt too much to the Japanese. And then there's the final, what Nehru himself regards as something that must have been very painful for Gandhi to do. All the while he's saying, you cannot have foreign troops on Indian soil. If the Japanese come, our job is to meet them with passive non-resistance, which is what he argued everywhere. It was consistent with his view on non-violence. there's a certain moral equivalence between violence and counter-violence, aggression and counter-aggression. So he didn't see the world in as ideological terms as Nehru did, for instance. But towards the end, quite significantly, June, July, and I don't know whether it's an accident or not, by then the Japanese had lost 2 major battles. He says, it's all right, those troops can stay. And Louis Fisher is so struck that Gandhi has taken such a position suddenly. He actually says, have you informed Ninditko about this? He doesn't know. And Gandhi just responds by saying, he hasn't asked me. And then Madam Shankar Singh writes to Nehru saying how difficult it must have been for for Gandhi to have changed his view. So there are changes that, I mean, there are changes in attitudes, and these were shaped by the war. And that's, I think, one of the things I've tried to do in these chapters on politics of war and the entry of Japan is actually to try and analyze it from this perspective.
Absolutely. So the final question with regard to the final chapters, can you tell us what happened at Madras Zoo?
Yeah, so the Malabar Special Police was called in. I mean, so basically Hope scatters his government. He gets news, I think on April. So let me tell you the story from the beginning.
Please.
So I think, forgive me if I've got a date slightly wrong, but around April 8th, there is a sort of aging Atlanta that takes off from Madras, and that it spots 3 Japanese planes somewhere 40 miles off the coast of Madras. And this is a big aircraft, but it's used for reconnaissance. The story goes that the Japanese planes get scared, which is, I think, probably not true, but they turn away, and the 2 days, and they come back. 2 days later, there is false military intelligence that a big Japanese fleet is to make landfall somewhere south of Madras. By April 15th, they're supposed to make landfall. Hope flies to Bangalore, meets Lieutenant General there, who confirms that this is true, and then decides to disband his government. So his government just scatters. Part of the High Court goes to Coimbatore, part of it goes to Anantapur, departments go to Salem, to Bangalore, pretty much everywhere. There's complete scattering, and there's just a skeleton staff that remains in Chennai. And on that day, the Commissioner of Madras, April 14th, he goes to Fort St. George, and he's ordered by one of Hope's advisors to shoot all the dangerous animals dead. By dangerous, you meant lions and tigers and so on, bears, and also venomous snakes. And the idea was that if the bombs fall, these animals could escape their enclosures and then prey on people. So they go in and shoot all these animals dead. And while I was researching this, I found this was not exactly unique. People were doing this in other places as well. They did it in Rangoon, for instance. There was small incidents in other places like this. But more importantly, animals were very much a part of the discourse during World War II. I mean, there's this fantastic book on how, I forget the number, I think it's some 6 lakhs something, pets were actually put to death in Britain because they felt that, if they were bombed, there wouldn't be enough. The kindest thing to do would be to kill the pets, and Brits actually waited in line to sort of get their pets exterminated before the first bombs fell. So there is a section not just on the zoo but on animals and war at the end, which is a kind of epilogue essentially.
I believe the first bombs that fell in Germany on Berlin killed the elephant in the zoo. So bombing and animals.
The first bombs?
The first retaliatory bombings on Berlin.
The retaliatory bombs.
By the sort of British during when Churchill ordered retaliatory attacks during the Blitz. I believe that they fell on Berlin Zoo, and that's what kind of prompted Hitler to order the sort of blitz to focus on cities rather than on airfields. So one theory is that that may have changed the course of the war. Again, it may or may not be true. But nevertheless, a fascinating discussion about a fascinating book. I will now invite Professor Shobi to make some finishing comments.
People spoke about, I think it was about 4 years ago in one of our car rides to Chennai, about a story that he has been thinking about, and it's really, really wonderful to see that come out in the form of a book. What I want to do is to make 3 brief remarks about 3 lessons that this book holds for history students. We've been talking about some of these lessons in my class this morning and earlier also last week. And I wanted to specifically make these remarks because Mukund, both in his comments and in the book also talks about writing a book on history without being trained as a historian. And I assure you it's a very good thing. Some of my favorite historians are journalists, David Remnick or David Halberstam or John Beecham, who've done such wonderful books on American presidents, European leaders, and so on and so forth. Okay, my first point. When I started grad school, my first month I was completely bewildered. I was bewildered not because grad school is a new experience, but because all the scholars, professors with whom I wanted to work, I was familiar with their scholarship, but when I went to study with them, I couldn't recognize what they were doing because they were all doing, sort of either discursive discourse analysis or some kind of intellectual history which didn't look like history. So the question that me and my friends had was a simple one: what does it actually mean to do history now? And this has become a particular challenge for the craft of history writing. If you have to produce historical accounts in the age of postmodernism in the last 3 decades especially. So we often did what all history graduate students do, which is to go back to historiography and try to find some nice problem that one could work on, right, where we could find some conceit that we could hold on to and build up as a problem that nobody else had worked on, or some very nice angle that we could provide or reinterpretation we could provide. But nobody gave the answer that Mukund does, which is listen to your mothers and grandmothers. Right? So there you have, it's not a throwaway line or a trivial remark that I'm making. It gives you a very different kind of approach to storytelling. And we've been thinking about what does it mean to find a good story to tell, and where do those stories come from? They come from everywhere. Right? So it's just being able to keep our eyes open, ears open, and to find out, to realize the possibility of good stories which are there amidst us. That is what I think is in some ways the true genius of this book. Trying to find that angle within which you can tell the stories, all the familiar stories that we know about, whether it is Cripps mission, Congress's attitude towards the war, or eventually the story of decolonization. All of that gets told within this framework of people from Madras leaving home and coming back to find their homes looted. Right? The most ordinary thing that you could imagine, but it is also the most meaningful, the most concrete thing one could imagine. Right? Decolonization is some abstraction. What Congress feels about the war, how does Gandhi change his opinion, what does Nehru think about something, all these are abstractions. But, if you lose a year later everything that you've had at home, that's something concrete. And what Mukund also talks about, which is, his mother finding herself, learning more about herself, about shaping her life, right? These are concrete instantiations of, historical events within which we can embed all this. So all these old stories actually become new to us because of this framework. And that, I thought, was a really important lesson for us to internalize. The second, I think there's a line in the introduction on page 23, Roman letter, page number, where Mukund says, Mukund writes, and I quote, "But there's no reason why histories like fiction cannot be stories without ends." We spent about 15-20 minutes in the class this morning discussing that. Believe me when I say this, no historian shows the courage to pick a story which has no end. Right? I mean, that comes with training, where you're looking at a set of chronological events which can be reworked to have a beginning, middle, and end. If you don't have this structure, it doesn't become a historical account. It doesn't possess the kind of historical consciousness that it should. Right? So, to think about stories that may not have an end, and to then find ways of telling that story is, really an important understanding and important recognition. But how do these stories without an end look like? Right? What kind of stories do they become? And that's where I think the book becomes interesting, and that's the third lesson or third point that I want to make, which is how do you write a story of something that doesn't happen? Right? How do you write the story of a non-event? Right? And again, that's the real cleverness of this book. Right? To incorporate, to build a framework within which everything else can be narrated by taking this non-event as the framing device. And what that means is, if I were to take another 30 seconds to sort of talk about the two ways in which the World War, which doesn't happen in India, which doesn't come to India in the true sense, but it does come in two different ways. So you have an extensive participation of Indian soldiers, deployment of Indian resources in both the world wars, and that's recognized and elaborated by historians like Krea University in brilliant ways. But what Mukund does is to look at the consequences of what people, including the British, suspected to happen. They expected something to happen. They suspected something might happen, but it doesn't happen. But what are the consequences of these suspicions? What are the consequences of these expectations that we may have? And here you have a way of thinking about consequences, a way of telling stories about these, which might actually become very appropriate for our age, an age where anxieties, panic, fear begin to grapple us, take hold of us. In these times, it's not surprising that Mukund has found this template or this framework to tell a story, but that recognition of panic as the framework or anxiety as the framework to tell a story is what I think is extremely relevant for us. And it is for that recognition that we have to be grateful to Mukund. And I want to thank him, congratulate him for this wonderful accomplishment. It's a really clever